It's been estimated that an average American living in cities sees up to 4,000 ads a day. Ads are everywhere you look. Subways, bus stops, billboards, magazines. This toxic culture of mindless consumption exploits our innermost insecurities and desires to meet impossible standards. The corporate PR machine is enormously successful due to a model created by a man named Edward Bernays nearly a century ago. The nephew of Sigmund Freud, Bernays is considered the father of modern propaganda, or public relations. An Austrian aristocrat, Bernays' first contribution to the United States was helping President Woodrow Wilson sell the idea of World War I as a noble mission to spread democracy in Europe. In order to create the engineering of consent, Bernays argued, you must appeal to the unconscious mind. And on behalf of numerous corporate clients, Bernays helped perfect the tools of manipulation and conditioning that are used today. To understand more about the history of propaganda and the collusion between the U.S. empire and Fourth Estate, I talked to Professor of Media Studies at New York University, Mark Crispin Miller, who wrote the intro to the new edition of Bernays' 1928 seminal book, Propaganda. When did public opinion begin to stand out as a force to be managed by the establishment?
For all intents and purposes, I think it's probably most accurate to say that World War I marked an important turning point in the rise of what we call public opinion as a consideration for political leaders, and the science of propaganda, which was used and has been used with increasing sophistication to move public opinion in certain directions, basically to make sure that we don't succumb to anything like real democracy, you know? I mean, public opinion has to be respected, but not out of any respect for the popular will. It has to be respected as a kind of mighty beast that needs to be tamed unless democracy break out and upset the apple cart.
In the introduction you wrote to Bernays' book, Propaganda, you said his aim was not to urge the buyer to demand the product now, but to transform the buyer's very world so that the product must appear to be desirable as if without the prod of salesmanship. Talk about how this strategy has been institutionalized.
What Bernays understood brilliantly was the need to kind of shape the flow of events, to influence the media in a general way, to create an atmosphere in which large numbers of people would end up making certain choices, coming to certain conclusions without really being aware of any stimulus, you see. So he had a lot of contempt for advertising because it was too explicit, it was too blatant, it was saying buy this. I mean, it wasn't quite as simplistic as he made it sound. He badmouthed advertising and disdained it in favor of his own method. It was to kind of create the climate in which people would do certain things to benefit his clients. My favorite example is that, you know, he represented a piano company. How to get people to buy pianos? Well, he did this by creating a craze for music rooms in homes, right? He actually contacted people in the architectural magazines and so on, and in the news media, people who wrote about lifestyle and so on. They didn't use that term then. In order to create a kind of trend for music rooms. Okay, well, you have a music room, what are you going to put in it? I mean, obviously, most, you know, middle and upper middle class people want to buy pianos, you see. So even though he never mentioned the name of the piano company and didn't even harp on pianos per se in the propaganda, it had the general net effect of getting people to buy more pianos, so the client was happy. He had, you know, a contract to help increase sales for American tobacco, and one of the most important things that he did to that end was to get Hollywood to incorporate cigarette smoking much more consciously and often artfully into the scenarios of movies, to get them to write cigarette smoking, lighting up, and so on, to write all that into the stories, you see. So it developed a kind of, grammar of, seduction, and, you could express various kinds of emotions with cigarettes, depending on, who lit you up or whatever. But the point I'm trying to make is that he understood that the inexplicit, the kind of inexplicit influence, just creating a large-scale shift in the weather, to get people to do certain things. That was his great insight, you see. And now you ask, how did that come to define our world, basically? Mm-hmm. Well, let me answer that question by stepping back to say that I think that we live at a moment when propaganda has never been so pervasive, has never been so influential, has never been so dangerous. And I mean propaganda. I know that the word sounds terribly quaint. I say propaganda, people think of, Chinese voices coming squawking over loudspeakers in Beijing, or they think of Soviet posters, right? Or Nazi propaganda. They think of Leni Riefenstahl. Actually, propaganda is not a totalitarian phenomenon primarily, although we have long since learned to think that it is, right? Propaganda is as American as apple pie. Propaganda at its most sophisticated was perfected, and I mean not just political propaganda, but commercial propaganda. Both kinds of propaganda were perfected jointly by the United States and Britain. In Mein Kampf, Hitler, in his famous chapter on war propaganda, talks about how deeply he admired what a brilliant job the British propagandists had done in World War I, had nothing but contempt for the German propaganda, and resolved to make sure that his own and the Nazi Party's propaganda would be brilliant in imitation of the British, you see? So, how many people does the world of propaganda employ in the United States, if you think about it? I mean, it isn't only people in public relations. It's also people in advertising agencies. It's also people in the world of so-called public diplomacy. It's also people in the world of what we call lobbying. There are countless euphemisms that we use today for propaganda, right? If you go up to a person in an ad agency or a PR specialist and say, well, how's the propaganda going? They're going to be insulted. They're going to feel like you've called them a dirty name. They don't understand that they do propaganda, right? They do propaganda. And the rise of all those euphemisms for it is a direct result of the successful effort to cast propaganda as something that they do in those closed societies. The Russians do it, the Chinese do it, the Iranians do it, the Venezuelans do it, the Cubans do it. We don't do it. We educate people. We provide them with information. And that misrepresentation of propaganda has had the paradoxical effect of making it extraordinarily effective. See, because propaganda works best when you don't see it for what it is.
The level of sophistication is completely unreal, and it's not just people being aware of the propaganda and commercialism coming at them, tens of thousands of advertisements every day, and being able to tune them out. It's things beyond that, the implants within the propaganda. Talk about that, the layers.
That's a good point. I mean, first of all, I want to say people tend to pride themselves on not falling for propaganda. People say, commercials don't work on me. I can see through them. And there are a number of ad campaigns that have successfully appealed to that idea, the kind of winking, ironic advertising. It and you share a little chuckle or a little smirk over the fact that you're too smart to fall for this, right? This is kind of a postmodern move that advertising makes. Well, it's been making it in various ways really since the 30s, okay? People don't understand that even if they consciously scorn a particular ad as cheesy, or they tell themselves they don't really believe the claims, that has nothing to do with what they'll end up buying if they happen to get thirsty and they go into a store somewhere. But, you know, let's move away from the world of what they call white propaganda, which is to say propaganda that announces itself as propaganda. That's TV commercials, political speeches, stuff like that, you know. And let's move into the world of what we call gray propaganda, which is propaganda that disguises itself as journalism or, you know, any number of dodges and disguises that propaganda puts on, right? Product placement in movies is a form of gray propaganda, you know. And then a movie like Argo, for example, or Zero Dark 30, to move to more sinister examples, are movies that have a kind of geopolitical agenda that are, you know, making a case for very powerful interests within the state. Movies that the CIA has actually helped the producers make, you know.
And let's talk about what's behind the propaganda. Bernays is quoted as saying, "We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we've never heard of." Who are the invisible governors that are controlling these ideas?
Yeah, well, it's important to note that Bernays didn't think of that as a bad thing.
Yeah,
you know,
the heroic elite.
Yeah, he thought that was a good thing because his assumption was that these august figures, these mighty figures in the worlds of business and politics and the media were essentially benign. He actually believed that. He thought there was a kind of rationality operating up top, you know, which, you know, as I point out in my own introduction to the new edition of propaganda, is a groundless claim. Because often people who devote themselves to propaganda end up believing it themselves. You know, if you have a vested interest in a particular version of the truth, you're going to believe it.